Today we're going to be recording, and we're going to be talking about planning and hosting accessible and inclusive events. And before we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of context for this event. This is our very first event of this year's Disability as Diversity Month, and we thank everyone on the Accessibility Committee and others who have really helped to make this month really exciting and obviously successful already, with so many people here with us today. And Stacy, I don't know if you have the ability to do this since you're screen sharing, but I wonder if you could put the link to the rest of the events in the chat for folks. If not, we can do that later.
I would have to stop screen sharing to get the link, but maybe when we send out the recording, I could also send out a link.
Sure, that's great. Or we can drop it in later.
Okay.
But feel free to jump over to our website at some point also to find out more about the rest of the events. I will say that next week we have a visit at the rec center. So if you're not familiar already, Campus Rec has a lot of accessible and inclusive options for disabled students and faculty and staff, but also for folks who just want to participate in activities with disabled students. So for example, you can rent an athletic wheelchair and play wheelchair basketball, even if you're not a wheelchair user. And they have a lot of options like that. And so there's a tour on the list of events over at Campus Rec. And then the QRC is doing a social gathering for queer and trans disabled students in their space. And then at the end of the month, Stacy here has really been the lead coordinator on an event about Discrit, which is a theory, a study of the combination of critical race theory and disability studies. We're really excited about that. So we hope that you'll join us at one of those other events. Thanks, Shayna, for dropping that into the chat. Okay, so this is going to be about a 60-minute session, and we're going to go over the new PSU Inclusive Guide to Meetings, Events, and Conferences, and other suggestions for creating inclusive events. There will be time throughout the session for participation. So if you have questions or comments, contributions of any kind, please just hold them until we kind of pause for that moment, and then there'll be time at the end too for Q&A. And I probably should have said this earlier, but we do have a closed captioner here with us today, and you may have noticed the little bar at the top that lets you know that you can enable closed captioning or the transcript. And so go ahead and do that if that would be helpful to you. All right. So I think with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, Stacy, and let's get going. So again, my name is Jen Duggar Spalding. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Disability Resource Center at PSU. And I've been here for about 10 years, and I'm a white woman, 40-something-year-old white woman with curly blondish brown hair, brown glasses, and I'm usually wearing earrings that dangle of some kind. I'm going to pass it on to Stacy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Stacy Taniguchi. I use she, her pronouns, and I am pictured here with kind of shoulder-length black hair. I'm a Japanese woman in my mid-30s, I guess, and I'm wearing some brown translucent glasses, a blue sweater, and a gold necklace, and I am smiling in my picture. And I will toss it to Travis.
Hello, I'm Travis Block of Facilities and Property Management, where I'm the analyst programmer. I use he, him pronouns, and in my image, I am a white 30-year-old male wearing glasses, smiling with a short beard and a blue shirt. And I'm often only ever wearing Carhartt shirts. So I guess continue on.
Thanks, Travis. So this is Stacy speaking again. I'm going to start us with a land acknowledgement. Portland State University is located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon, in Multnomah County. We honor the Indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Kathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin and Kalapuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. And this land acknowledgement was written by the PSU Native American Student and Community Center. A couple things I want to note is it's really important to pronounce the Indigenous tribes shared in land acknowledgements. So highly recommend doing research ahead of time. I've been at events where people didn't even like take a look at what they'd be reading, and names will get skipped over or horribly mispronounced. So that's something really important. Land acknowledgements are also, sometimes they can be contested. So I think while land acknowledgements can promote a lot of visibility for Indigenous groups and lands, there's also the so what. So I know, I'm not sure if Bree is here, but the Pacific Islander Asian and Asian American Student Center, or PIA, they have kind of a call to action that they share after this land acknowledgement. And I think there are different ways that we could be really thoughtful about action, because that's important beyond just sharing the land acknowledgement. Okay, so we're going to go over a lot of information today and things we hope you will consider while listening to some information we share, as well as questions to consider when you are planning your upcoming event or meeting. Are, what are the key takeaways for your audience? What do you want them to leave thinking about, feeling, and or knowing? And how will you host an event that fosters the kind of environment where every student or participant will feel like they belong? Creating a more engaging, accessible, and safe space. It's important to align your event with the mission of the organization, so your department and PSU. It's also important to consider the myth of the average participant, the average student, the average attendee. Events are often designed with what the majority of attendees would want or need. But in considering that there are so many variables to how a participant engages in an event or meeting, when we cater to the majority, a lot of participants will at some level feel like their needs aren't being met. Most often these are like marginalized identities that people have. And so when we center the most marginalized participants, then this often creates access for so many other people to participate. And Jen has a really great image that discusses this in the next slide. We advise that you stay flexible and adapt. There's no way you can anticipate everything with an event, right? If y'all are event planners, you know this, right? Something happens. So staying flexible, being adaptable, giving yourself extra room in your budget, extra time to plan ahead the day of, all this is really important. And then do whatever you can. If you can do it, then you should. Even if you didn't have advance notice, if it's possible, please try. We talked yesterday in our planning meeting how Travis mentioned that often even just trying our best to meet someone's accessibility need is often really appreciated. It doesn't always have to be perfect, but trying is really important.
Thank you so much, Stacy. So this is the image that Stacy was mentioning on the last slide, and I'll describe it. So this cartoon is from 2002, and it shows the outside of a school building, and there's snow covering the stairs and the ramp. And there's a custodian there who is shoveling snow from the steps, and there's school children waiting to get in. And one of those children is a wheelchair user. And that student says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the custodian says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I'll clear the ramp for you." And that child says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." And I have to admit, I saw this cartoon for the first time in 2005, and I remember exactly where I was and exactly who showed it because it blew my mind. And yeah, it was 2005, but I had been working in disability services for a while before that. And it still blew my mind. And the reason is because we were so focused at that time on accommodation. And I think that that still is the case now, that we focus so much on just doing what the student asks or just doing what is compliance, right? And sure, it would be compliance to shovel the steps and then shovel the ramp. But when we go beyond compliance and we do something that could work for the greatest majority of people, then we're doing something that's both centering the disabled person and the accessibility need, but also, you know, centering everyone. Everyone gets access. I do want to say, though, that, you know, doing universal design, which is what this is describing, doesn't always mean doing one thing. So in this cartoon, you know, clearing the ramp is universal design. Everyone is going to get in. But I think sometimes universal design is mistaken for doing one thing that's going to work for everyone. And there's just not one fit for every person in every situation, right? So oftentimes universal design instead is doing a variety of things. So for example, you know, we are showing you slides today. We're talking you through this content. We have a captioner here to also help convey information. And we're going to share these slides afterwards. We're also sharing with you a book. So these are all like different ways to convey the same information. And there's a recording. So if someone wants to watch this later, they can, right? So that is an example of universal design. And I think that's really important to demystify. This isn't just one thing that's going to work for everyone. Let's see. And it can mean more time. It can mean more resources, more staff, more money on the front end. But it's always going to take more time, and it's always going to cost more and be more frustrating for everyone involved if an event is not created with accessibility in mind and it has to be tacked on later. Even if every year, you know, you're doing a different kind of event, you still could have an accessible template that you use to proactively prevent issues from coming about. Accommodations are prevented. The only reason why the Disability Resource Center exists for classroom access is because our classroom spaces are not already accessible. They're not already inclusive to disabled students, right? And so students, in order to get the access that we know that they need, have to kind of come through the back door and all this other red tape and ask DRC for access when it could just be built in from the beginning. So again, accommodations don't have to be needed necessarily if you're planning your event with that in mind. And obviously, like Stacy was saying, this isn't just about inclusion of disabled people. Universal design is a concept that was originally created. The concept was created by a physically disabled architect who was talking about physical space and how centering disabled people in the creation of physical space creates more inclusion for everyone. But universal design isn't just about that. It's about understanding unconscious bias. It's about avoiding all the ways that we unintentionally usually create microaggressions. It's about trauma-informed practices. It's about using plain language. I wonder if you all have other thoughts on what universal design consists of, like what other concepts we should be thinking about in creating something that's universally designed. Does anybody have anything? You can just drop it in the chat, or if the chat doesn't work for you, then you can unmute, but I think we prefer it to be in the chat if you can. Providing information in more than one format. Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Nancy. Providing information more than once. Yes, Shayna, thank you. Yeah, so you all can keep dropping ideas in the chat if you'd like. Artie says expecting access needs to change over time. Yeah. So these are really great suggestions, and think these through as we continue through the slides, but just in the interest of time, I think we're going to move forward. Thank you. So when you are thinking about your meeting that you're planning, there are so many different aspects of a meeting or an event or a conference that you would need to think about. So the people, the who's been invited, or who maybe just will show up, right? You might not, if you're not doing an RSVP, you might not know exactly who's going to be there. But thinking about the kinds of people or the kinds of needs that might be in the room is going to be really helpful when thinking about your event. The location, the physical location, maybe the online location, whether you're having it on online or not, or what platform it's in. If it's in physical space, what's the room setup like? You know, are the seats in a circle? Is there room to move in between desks or tables? What seating options exist? Does everything have fixed arms so that someone who's maybe larger wouldn't feel comfortable? Or are there seats that have lumbar support for folks who have chronic pain? The time of the program. So is the time that you've selected going to work for the greatest number of people possible? Is the length of the program going to work for the greatest number of people possible? Is the date a good one? Are we avoiding religious holidays? Is the format going to be accessible for the folks who will show up? So if it is an in-person event, is it like dialogue heavy? Is it a lecture event, and is that going to keep folks engaged? Invitation creation, distribution, if this is happening electronically, is it happening accessibly? And there's a whole lot to say about online accessibility that we're not going to go into today. But if you look at the guide, there is a link there to the PSU digital accessibility resources. And that's where you can find a lot of information about online access. But it's really important, especially for our blind and visually impaired students, that we be thoughtful about how we're creating our invitations. So we're not just, excluding folks before they even get a chance to look at the invite. And then how things are being distributed. Are we distributing our invite information across the board, or just to specific groups of people? Are we explicitly including marginalized groups to join us? And then the program content itself, right? Like, why is it that you're even having this program? So there's so much to think about. If you all have other contributions to this slide, I would love to see them in the chat. So are there other things besides what has been mentioned here that you would be thinking about in creating your event? And maybe we've thought of everything. Yes, Julie, thank you. Food and beverage, right. So what kinds of food options are you offering, if any, and are they inclusive? And Kay says, are marginalized voices centered in the speakers, the media, and the content involved? Absolutely. And Nancy said, are the elevators working? Right. Yeah. So even if you schedule an accessible space, technically, is it actually accessible now? Yeah. All right, Stacy, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we've given you a lot to think about so far. I want to share just a few snippets of stories from what I've overheard in the last 10 years at the DRC. It was a long time ago that this happened, but there was a student who came to our office just as we were closing, who was about to attend something over at Lincoln Hall. They were hard of hearing, and they were used to going to events somewhere else that always had auditory amplification devices and or live captioning. And they just showed up right at the last minute before we were closing, before the event, and didn't know where to go or who to talk to or what was available. And that was because nothing about this event included that information. So That would have been really helpful, obviously. The next thing, totally different, but this student, again, a while ago, pre-pandemic, was presenting an award at a ceremony, and they had a physical disability and could not access the stage in the same way as other people. So there, I think in this situation was a ramp, but when everyone else entered the stage and then exited the stage, they kind of went like across the whole stage. And in this situation, the student had to kind of go back and interrupted the flow of traffic where other people were still coming, and it was awkward, and it was obvious that it was only happening for them because they had a disability, and that was just frustrating. There was another student, a student who is blind, who attended an orientation and went through the whole orientation. PowerPoint slides were up, lots of visual information on the slides. The person who was presenting didn't do a great job of being explicit about what was on the slides, instead said a lot of like, this is a great opportunity, right? Instead of describing what this actually was. And so the student got the slides after the event had ended and ended up going back and kind of revisiting everything throughout the day to really know what was going on. And then a student who uses a wheelchair showed up at an SFC committee meeting in a room that you all might know within Smith that happens to have stairs outside of it. And they ended up scrambling and moving the space to another place. But, obviously that is not ideal. So these are just some of the stories, some of the reasons why this guide came to be, and why we think it's really important. Thanks, Stacey.
Thanks, Jen. And again, with these stories that are shared by students in our campus community, the accessibility community, DRC et al. Began to develop these documentations and then ultimately curate them into a single document. And that's where the Inclusive Guide to Meetings and Events and Conferences was created. On this slide, by the way, is an image of the title page of the document, as well as there is a link to the Inclusive Guide that is also served on the DRC's webpage on the PDX site. This is just going to be a quick overview, and ultimately what the guide is covering is considerations for planning events with accessibility in mind, marketing ideas and expectations, some presentation suggestions for not only the material at those presentations, as well as how the presenter should, I guess, present, as well as day of considerations and virtual events. Conveniently, I think we've had a lot of experience to learn more about virtual events over these past few years. And so we thought it crucial to include that as well. Next slide. And I think before continuing on, I think it's important to point out a little bit more of the development. Aside from just simply being, it's the right thing to do for our campus community, I think a lot of the rationale for it is that the DRC does regularly get these inquiries about how to provide inclusivity and accessibility for events. The guide also meets the accessibility committee's goal of ensuring that all campus events are developed with accessibility in mind. Many iterations of this guide have been made over the past few years, and our plan is to continue to review it annually. And to Stacy Young's example from the prior slide, our next evolution is to ultimately bring it into other formats than just this document, because while PDFs are beautiful at times, I think a lot of the time they can be challenging for others to access. And while the guide is accessible, dedicating web pages for further accessibility is important. So the accessibility committee is made up of wonderful individuals across campus, and together we collaborate on ways to improve inclusivity for members of our community. And one subcommittee in particular helped develop this document, or really bring it to where it is today. And these are all of my colleagues that I wanted to acknowledge, who have worked on the document, who have met regularly over the past few years, and really polished this up. So I thank Randy Mischler of Campus Events, and Caitlin Sweeney of Career Services, Julie Wallace of UCOM, as well as many of the other individuals who have left the university who were part of our group. So thank you very much. Next slide. So kind of the first and foremost, I think when we think about planning events is always planning for the costs. And like Jen said in a prior slide, that thinking about accommodations and accessibilities does have a potentially an added price. So ensuring that you're proactive is very important to understanding how to consider budgeting. So perhaps adding line items and sorts of things of that nature. And the guide goes over a little bit of what you should consider. Along with that, being inclusive to other folks' needs, understanding who your audience is, and considering what they will likely need to even come to your event. I think the perfect example, or a good example of that, is childcare right at the top of this list. So childcare, Little Vikings has options for childcare for events on campus. Individuals with food restrictions are things to consider. Language interpreters. Language interpreters and translated being available in case not all of your attendees are speaking English in this case, as well as multilingual marketing materials and events materials that promote the event. And then lastly, one of my personal things is assessing restroom accessibility. I think we've all been in that situation where you're scrambling to identify the nearest restroom for your event. So it's very much appreciative to have. And it's little questions like this that are quick to answer, won't really change the way you develop your event. You're likely asking these already, and that's kind of a nice thing about this accessibility guide, is it's just a slight reminder. I don't believe it would be an expectation to read this entire guide for every single event that you're planning, but it does provide those questions that you can consider. Could you move to the next slide? Continuing on with just your audience, you likely know your audience, and with that knowledge, accommodating for those folks is going to be considerably easy. However, if not, just consider asking some of these questions to yourself as you are planning. Is who may be in attendance? Is it children, older adults, people with chronic pain? This list goes on. And logistics are certainly important to an event. And by pausing to consider the needs of your audience, you're not really only enhancing the event itself, but you're also providing an even bigger opportunity for your audience to take in your message or the experience you want to give them. Next slide. And then adding on to that with marketing, being sure that your digital materials are fully accessible. There is a link on this slide to PSU's digital accessibility webpage, where it is an excellent resource. In addition to your materials, providing the phrase here that I will read aloud to let individuals who need accommodation know who to contact for the event. And certainly I believe sometimes you yourself might have even experienced an event where you couldn't necessarily go or want to go because you didn't know more information on it. So I think this is a very critical piece to adding to your marketing. So that phrase that you would like to add or should add or will add, requests for reasonable accommodations may be made to inserting your name of the individual who's representing your event, their phone and email, in order to ensure that reasonable accommodations can be provided in time for this event. Please make your request as soon as possible. Lastly, consider having a diverse group of people reviewing your materials before distribution. And I think Jen on the next slide can kind of share an example of maybe an oopsie. Next slide.
Sorry, I was having a hard time unmuting. Actually, and I'm going to drop something I was just finishing typing in the chat, but just to tag on to what Travis was saying, that I think if you're using this guide, or if you're really being inclusive about your event, to definitely give people the information about how to request accommodations, but also to let them know that you have been inclusive and thoughtful about accessibility when planning the event. I think that's really helpful for folks. But yeah, this is definitely an oopsie. I like the way you put that, Travis. So, you know, we want to make sure that there's a diverse group of people reviewing materials before they go out. And my Twitter and Facebook feed was ablaze recently when this advertisement for a university in Australia was put up around town. And so anyway, if you are not able to see this image, so there's a male appearing person sitting at a table with let's see, 5 other female presenting people around them, and the male person looks like they are explaining something, and everyone else is just looking at that person like, tell us everything you know. And so anyway, I think that my first reaction to this was, were there no women at the table when University of Adelaide decided to use this image? Because this like definitely is giving off like a mansplaining kind of vibe. And you know, if you're really trying to be inclusive, obviously this isn't the way to do it. So I just wanted to pop this into the presentation as a good example of what not to do. All right, so for presenter suggestions, and some of these show up in the guide, but I'll tell you, one of my pet peeves is going to a conference, and gosh, this happens at conferences about disability access, where, you know, folks have access to a microphone and they say things like, oh no, I don't need that, thank you. Or I speak loud enough for everyone. The microphone should definitely be available if you can make it available. And if it is available, please use it. That's a way to create more access for everyone. And then introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns if you wish. It shouldn't be required that folks share their pronouns. And if someone chooses not to, then that's okay. But definitely that can be helpful for inclusion if folks want to share their pronouns and everyone's already doing it. Speak slowly, enunciate well, facing the audience. That's especially helpful in a situation where, like today, we have a captioner with us, or if you have an ASL interpreter with you, that's going to be really important. Repeat audience questions that aren't spoken into the microphone. So you may have noticed that I was repeating things that were in the chat. And I would do that also in a physical space when folks couldn't access the microphone, just to be sure everyone could hear that information as well as possible. And then be explicit in what you're saying. I gave that bad example earlier of, you know, a student having to sit through something where someone said the words this or that to describe something that was visually represented. Instead, say what it is that you're pointing out, or describe images the way that I just described the one on the last slide, right? It doesn't take that much extra time to do that. And then don't ask folks to all stand. Sometimes we do that. You can say stand if you're able or if you would like. Or maybe there are other things depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish that you can say so that everyone is able to participate. Don't ask folks to move around the room without considering the space. So there might not be enough room for that. There might not be space for a wheelchair to move. And then if things come up where there's some sort of like oppressive statement or some sort of inequity that's coming up, make sure to address it as well as possible, as quickly as possible, as explicitly as possible, so that everyone kind of knows what the values are of the organization, and what the organization is doing to address those issues, right? All right, and so on the day of, there are several things to consider in the guide as well. Some of these, I think most of these are in there. I did add one or two. So consider providing different color name tags or lanyards to distinguish those who do not wish to be filmed or photographed. That might be a helpful way for the photographer to know who to include and who not to include. And then as part of your welcome statement, you might consider including that land acknowledgement, maybe with the land back addition that Stacy mentioned. And again, like just an acknowledgement without any action is not the best. So if there is some action that you can take as well as the acknowledgement, then that's always going to be the best way to proceed with that. And then discuss any content warnings and encourage guests to take breaks for self-care. So, you know, if this is just if this is an event that might be personally difficult or maybe politically charged, then you might want to include that in the beginning statement. And then invite people with specific dietary needs to get their food first. I really appreciate this one. I was vegetarian for a very long time, and my partner is gluten-free. And so, you know, it's always really frustrating when you end up at the back of the line, and then by the time you get there, all that's available is food that you can't eat. And frustrating is one way to put it. And, you know, for other folks, it's not just frustrating, but that might be the only option for food that they have, so they might not be able to eat. Okay. Next slide. I think I have an image on the next slide that I want you to see. So this is a good example. I'm done with the bad examples for now. This is a good example of universal design. And this was something that I saw right after folks started coming back into physical spaces during COVID. But it doesn't have to be about COVID. So there are 3 baskets on a table. The leftmost basket includes bracelets that are red, and there's a sign that says, "Hi, I'm keeping my distance." The next basket is full of yellow bracelets and says, "Okay with talking, but not touching." And then the next basket is full of green bracelets and says, "Okay with handshakes and high fives." So, you know, this could be used for COVID, but also, you know, for folks who are autistic or who otherwise just do not feel like engaging socially. This can be a great way to create universal design in your event.
Okay. Thanks, Jen, for sharing those. This is Stacy again. So we have some virtual event suggestions. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. I love seeing other people are sharing ideas of other universal design ideas. And so by all means. So for virtual event suggestions, make sure all of your technology works and you know how to use it in advance. I'm sure we've all been in meetings where a presenter has accidentally started talking and they've been muted, so we can't hear them, right? So double checking things. Mute everyone on entry to reduce background noise if applicable. Using automatic captions on Zoom if not using a professional captioner. And I want to emphasize that automatic captions on Zoom are never going to be as accurate as a live captioner, professional captioner. So automatic captions on Zoom is an example of universal design. People use captions for a variety of reasons, but if someone requests an accommodation for real-time captioning professional captioner, then that automatic captioning doesn't fit the need. And you can work with the DRC to request a captioner or ASL, American Sign Language interpreter. We have resources to connect you. And once again, what Jen said in the chat, the DRC wouldn't pay for this, but we can help facilitate the request. Record for those not in attendance. We are doing that today. And explicitly allow folks to turn off their cameras. So naming this can be really important for people who, for a variety of reasons, can't concentrate when their camera is on. A note about COVID. So COVID safety for marginalized communities. Please remember that COVID is not over, especially for many disabled and immunocompromised people. And then there's a quote from Leah Lakshmi Piepsina Samarasina, who is a disability justice and disability rights activist, who says, "We increasingly feel pushed out of public life as events and spaces from urgent cares to ERs to conferences say, oh, we're not doing virtual anymore. We're talking about it, but it feels like no one else is. And many of us feel incredibly alone in our grief and in the disorientation of feeling like we're the only ones stubbornly remembering." Some other suggestions: creating an event kit. So this could include a first aid kit with latex-free supplies for those who have a latex allergy. It includes earplugs, extra event supplies such as unscented markers, blank name tags, presentation items. I remember always having a roll of blue painter's tape around my arm when I was doing events in person. Unscented bathroom and cleaning products for folks with chemical sensitivities and scent sensitivities. Bike tire pump and patch kit for bike or wheelchair tires. Garbage bags and bins. I've seen so many garbage bins overflowing during events, and this could create physical barriers and hazards for people as they move around. Water bowl for service dogs, door stops, but do not use these for any fire doors. Extra phone chargers. I'm curious if anyone else has any ideas of an event kit item that might be helpful for any event planners. I remember along with blue painter's tape, I'd always have a Sharpie, an extra paper if I had to make a last minute sign, having large print agendas or electronic agendas for different people to access that. And then I'm just keeping an eye on the chat in case anyone else adds anything. But a variety of things you could have. It'll never be perfect and all encompassing, but we can always try to do our best and to do better. How universal design has been used in event planning. So universal design, well, we've discussed quite a bit how it has to do with disability and accessibility. It can support a variety of different needs for participants. I have a real life example that happened a couple of years ago. For folks who remember EMSA, Enrollment Management and Student Affairs, when we were one division, there was like a leadership summer conference, and McMiniman's Kennedy School got booked. And then later on, after there was a deposit paid, we found out that they do not offer gender inclusive bathrooms. And so as a part of the event committee, we booked a room to create our own gender inclusive restroom. And the days of the event, it actually was also used as a lactation space, which was something we hadn't even thought of. But people came and said, "Is there a lactation room?" And we were like, "Well, we didn't think about that, but we do have something, right?" So how else can universal design be used in event planning? Does anyone else have any examples about how universal design might help create access for multiple different reasons? And again, you can share in the chat if you are able, or if you need to unmute and speak out loud, you are welcome to do that as well. One idea I'm thinking is with large events like graduation ceremonies. I remember we found the need to have some spaces marked for accessible seating, not only for folks who might need more time to get places because of they use mobility tools or they're older, but also for people who had strollers who needed more space to park their strollers, space for us to substitute accessible furniture for the other ones. So all these range of different reasons why creating just something simple as like a marked extra space for seating was able to address. Okay, I'm looking at time, so I am going to go to the next slide, but please, oh, Kathy, fragrance-free products in the bathroom hardly covers it for chemical sensitivity. Does the DRC have recommended language regarding the wearing of fragrance, cologne, perfume to include in event advertising? Thanks for that question, Kathy. PSU actually has a, and Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's called a fragrance-free statement. Oh, thanks, Jen. Fragrance-free statement that Jen's going to share in the chat. I want to say that even though it's a PSU statement, I know this isn't observed everywhere, but I think it's something thoughtful that event organizers could include in event language. Okay, and now I think this goes back to Travis.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. And so perhaps at this point, you just might be surprised that there are just a lot of considerations to think about with universal design, accessibility, et al, inclusivity. But to be honest, I'm definitely right there with you, and I'm certain that Jen and Stacy are as well. This guide is a launching point for these conversations and considerations for you, but certainly at times the specific questions may not be in that guide. And on this slide is kind of a list of things that are not included in the events guide, but will be added possibly for future iterations. And that includes those specific and different types of events that you might be curious about, comments on heavy dialogue, events that are at large at scale, small, and entertainment, and so on. In more information on creating safe spaces for dialogue and personal sharing. Many topics can be heavy depending on what you're presenting. Culture city bags is another example of an idea that you can create for individuals who need additional sensory pieces to Jen, can you actually take this away? Because I can't necessarily explain it because your explanation was better.
Yeah, sure, Travis. Yeah, and so before the pandemic, I had worked with the Viking Pavilion in bringing Culture City bags to campus. They're used at the Moda Center and the zoo and other places like that around town. But they basically include like those large earmuffs that you might be using like during yard work. And also a variety of fidget toys and an ID badge too. And the ID badge is supposed to be worn on, it's on a lanyard, it's supposed to be worn by the person who's using the bag, just so that like in case of in case the person like gets overwhelmed, overstimulated, they can easily be kind of cared for by the event team and taken hopefully to a sensory space that's available. And even if there isn't a sensory space like available in the immediate vicinity, I think all of those other implements are really helpful for creating inclusion. And I have seen sensory spaces and conferences and other places where, you know, there is like a dedicated room set aside, which has like comfy furniture and low lighting and fidget toys or other things, maybe low soft music. And it's just like a place where you can go and either prevent overstimulation by kind of getting zenned out before you go into the event, or where you can go during an event that is overstimulating.
Thank you for that explanation, Jen. Continuing on, I think the red, yellow, green bracelets to indicate level of participation example that Jen showed on a previous slide is also a really good thing to consider adding, as well as the cost and equitable pricing structures you should consider. And then just from a personal experience, I think when creating content, events and whatnot for the university, I'm always a bit anxious and worried on whether it was enough. But to reiterate what we've been saying probably throughout all of these slides, is that if you authentically are putting your best effort into inclusivity, it's going to be better than not. And all of those subtle goof ups or things like that, or the punctuation errors that I likely forgot to miss in the guide or something, it's okay, because I would prefer to have my legacy or a legacy of simple goof ups than a legacy of not trying to improve a student's life. So to that, I'm excited to continue to work on this with my team.
Jen, I think this one is yours.
I'm sorry, I was just still trying to find the link to the fragrance-free value statement. I was almost there. But yeah, so if you all want to make future suggestions for future iterations of the guide, you can email me or Angie Telford. We're the two co-chairs of the Accessibility Committee, and we would be more than happy to take all of your suggestions. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the things that we even mentioned in this presentation weren't in the most recent iteration of the guide. So it's just always going to be changing and evolving to meet us where we're at and to change, to adapt to the different needs that we know our students and community members have. So with that, we just have like maybe 5 minutes till the end of the hour, but we would love to hear from you all either in the chat or unmute if you have some thoughts or suggestions for the group. Julie is giving Travis kudos. Kudos to Travis, who did an amazing job spearheading the development of the Inclusive Events Guide. And thank you, Jen and Stacy, for an informative event. Thanks, Julie. Appreciate you and all of the efforts that you've made too. Thank you, Artie, for the link to the fragrance-free value statement. Appreciate it. Anybody have any questions for us about how to be more inclusive, things that we didn't address today? I'm sure that there were a lot of things that we didn't cover. Let's see, Machu says, the last slide is great. Does the guide encourage event feedback or loops, surveys from attendee experiences? What could we have done better to create an inclusive event? I do think that feedback is mentioned, although very briefly. But yeah, that is one of the things that we could spend a lot more time on in future iterations of the guide, is just all variety of ways to get feedback from your attendees. I love that. Okay. Well, we really, really appreciate all of you being here with us today. As Stacy said, we're going to get the slides out to everyone and the recording. And we hope to see you at other Disability as Diversity Month events this month. And if you all are interested, I can drop that link I forgot to do that earlier. I can drop that link into the chat here before we all leave. Okay, here it comes. There you go. All right. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day and weekend, and we'll see you later.